All right. Hello. Um, I want to first introduce myself. My name is Anisa Tavangar. Um, I am a writer and curator and creative strategist based in New York City and Philadelphia. And I want to, of course, start off by thanking the National Association of Women Artists for inviting me to come and speak on this Tuesday afternoon. Um, So my work in the art spaces is pretty broad. I work um, right now for an organization called Four Freedoms that is at the intersection of art and civic engagement. And the real goal of Four Freedoms is to give artists voice in public discourse and in civic discourse. Um, and at Four Freedoms, I do a lot of work related to communications and sort of storytelling and understanding sort of how do we take the work that artists do and give it the right language to illuminate the stories that they're telling. Um, Beyond that, I've worked for galleries and artist studios and media companies and tech companies doing similar work of writing and storytelling, um, and also with a focus oftentimes on digital media. So thinking about how do we use digital platforms, be they video or social media or whatever else, to again tell these compelling stories to really unlock all the beauty that is hidden within the artworks that we know and love, and the works that we don't know and will grow to love. So I studied art history and Africana studies at Barnard College at Columbia University. And when I first went to college, I knew that I wanted to do art history. So that was never a question for me. And what I really value about having studied art history is that it teaches you to seek and appreciate beauty. It teaches you how to understand these visual stimuli, what to look for, and what does it mean, um, in your looking. But then, what I really value my Africana Studies education for is that Africana Studies teaches you how to look at an archive and understand things as an archive, and subsequently sort of how to ask these really pressing questions. Um, and so what I found is that throughout my education, I would be sitting in an art history class, and these questions would pop up in my mind about who's telling the story, who's leading this conversation, who constructed a space, who's deciding, what sort of works are allowed into a space or into an environment, how is it arranged, and sort of taking these questions that I had learned in studying sort of history and justice work into the art world, because of course it's all so interrelated. Um, and what I found was that there were a lot of really glaring, um, you know, hypocrisies and inequalities and injustices that were prevailing throughout, my education, throughout art spaces, and more than you know bringing up answers for me, it just brought up a lot of questions about why is it that we do things the way that we do them, and how can it be that a community of such curious and inquisitive and intelligent people allow for these things to take place. So that was really sort of the jumping off point of the work that I've done, in terms of the research that I've done. Um, so the title of the presentation is on decolonizing and democratizing art access and art spaces. Um, and so a lot of the work that I do also sort of in the sense of decolonizing is looking at the reality of the histories that exist within the art world and within art spaces, and understanding how, not necessarily from the fault of an individual or through blame, but kind of through our inevitable human flaws, um, that these sort of unjust structures emerge and remain. Um, and I want to share with you all a work of art that that really struck me when I first saw it, and still is, this very beautiful work. This is a work by Elanatsui, who is a contemporary Nigerian or Ghanaian sculptor based in Nigeria, called Bleeding Takari 2. And I'd like to read, as a writer, read something that I've written that talks about when I first encountered this work of art. I first saw Elanatsui's work at the Museum of Modern Art in 2013. In New York for Barnard's Admitted Students Weekend, I skipped an afternoon of programs thinking I would attend college elsewhere to visit the museum. After 4 hours of exploring the galleries, exhausted from the excursion and filled with contentment for my slow day, I wandered into a space that I thought would lead me back to the street. Instead, I landed in another gallery and was hit with a wave of awe. There it was, Bleeding Takari 2 by Elanatsui, a magnificent work of brilliant silver and acerbic red that towered over fellow museum goers and me. It puckered, dipped, rippled, and bled as if over languid limbs. Maybe it was in that moment that I decided to attend Barnard, just to stay close to that memory of overwhelming resplendence. Then, I of course decide to attend college in New York, and I have another experience. So, discovering Elanatsui at the Met, I had the opposite experience. I went to the Met during Barnard's orientation week and walked through the Rockefeller wing, reading the origins of works on view. Having just returned from a year of service where I volunteered alongside people from many of these places, I thought about my friends from Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, the Northwest Territories in Canada, Colombia, Kenya, Burkina Faso, and more. Reminiscing on my time with them, I didn't expect to find the same artist who had stunned me with his work about a year before. While the piece in the MoMA surged with intensity, the work I found tucked in the African gallery stood still. Its display became a fixation and an obligatory stop on any walk through the Met with friends to explain institutional bias. So this example of these two works by Elanatsui was really what sort of unlocked this realization in my mind about the responsibility and the role of art spaces in presenting works, and sort of how that influences how we understand them. So throughout, I ended up, writing my thesis on the Rockefeller Ring at the Met, which houses the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, and looking at the history of this space at the museum and this collection, the history of African art history as a discipline, and moving forward into the impact of this contemporary work in that space. And there are many things that I talk about. I talk about sort of course, a lot of the histories that go with it, but even choices that were made in the physical space. So for context also, this work was only meant to be hanging for 1 year, and they ended up keeping it up. And there are notions of sort of temporary display that you get, sort of this wall that's sort of awkwardly placed. It's painted this yellow, so you don't really see the full depth of the tones that are in the work. They're, the point of Elanatsui's work, and you really see it in the example in the MoMA, is to transform with light and turn these, what are liquor bottle caps that he makes work out of into these sort of glittering, like priceless gems and metals. And so without the light, you don't really have that transcendent transformation. And there are many, many, many issues. And as I sort of read, it became this obsession for me that I would always bring friends who would, when they were visiting the city, they would ask me for a tour of the museum, and I would take them here. And I would sort of explain, all of these contexts that have to do with this piece. So a question might be, why do I care so much? Why does it matter? And I think that this quote from this essay by James Baldwin summarizes some of these questions, really powerfully. So Baldwin writes in his essay, The Creative Process, "The entire purpose of society is to create a bulwark against the inner and the outer chaos in order to make life bearable and to keep the human race alive. And it is absolutely inevitable that when a tradition has evolved, whatever the tradition is, the people in general will suppose it to have existed from before the beginning of time, and will be most unwilling and indeed unable to conceive of any changes in it. They do not know how they will live without those traditions that have given them their identity." And I love this essay by James Baldwin. It's very short. I revisit it often. Um, but what this quote really kind of sums up is this notion of wanting to hold on to what we assume has always been. Um, and this example of criticizing a space like the Met, and again, not criticizing an individual, but really understanding sort of how institutional bias persists. Um, Criticizing an institution like this can be difficult because we assume that it upholds these really high ideals. We assume that the aesthetic values that it places on some works over others are inherent or are somehow tied to the nature of how human beings appreciate beauty. But the reality is that all of these things are taught to us. And the museum, in the way that it's set up, is continually reteaching us these notions. And this is something that, I struggle with because I adore visiting museums. I really enjoy the opportunity to see so many kinds of works housed in one space. And I think there's value to environments that allow this, because I also don't think that sort of a separatist approach is better. But it's also the reality that there have to be sort of flexibility, points of flexibility woven into the fabric of a space like this, because the only thing constant is change, and how we understand different types of art is of course always changing. Over the summer, sort of continuing off of, I'm always sort of thinking about this research that I did. We know that in the summer of 2020 there was a sort of this impatience that was born from our lockdown life, compounded with the stark injustices that we were all exposed to with the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. And I also have to mention that today is the 1-year anniversary of the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. In this moment, many people were using social media to respond to what they were witnessing as these injustices around them. And the art world was not immune. So, people were talking about, sort of should museums deaccession work to have funds to purchase work from artists of color? What's the responsibility of museums in sort of this process? The Museum of Natural History in New York City announced they're going to take down that statue of Teddy Roosevelt at the front. A lot of conversations about Confederate monuments, a lot of conversations about hiring tactics, a lot of conversations about sort of racist experience in the workplace. And throughout all of this, I was thinking about this research that I had done and how, curatorial and spatial structures also uphold these notions of white supremacy, which doesn't have to just be, people marching with tiki torches or, saying abhorrent things, but it can also be this sort of assumption that whiteness is better than, or the norm, or the standard. So after some consultation with a friend of mine, I decided that instead of, call people out and be kind of angry about it, what I can do is just sort of offer what I know and offer what I've discovered. So I created this series of slides that I posted to my Instagram, which I didn't expect to be seen very many times. And now on my own Instagram page, when an average post might get like 300 likes, this post on my page has almost 15,000 likes on it, which is crazy. And it was shared by so many people, and seen by many people. And what it really affirmed for me was that this work matters, and that, people are recognizing how important art spaces are in shaping the way that we see culture and the way that we understand beauty. So I want to just run through really quickly kind of some of these slides and then move into kind of how we can think about this in a larger context, because, this research is out there, you can take a look at it, but I want to talk about things that are a little bit beyond. So the post sort of begins with this question: how do museums uphold white supremacy? And looks at, so first is sort of a timeline of the Rockefeller wing, which is just one space of one museum in one city. Like, it's a really tiny little example of this. But it's important to note, these works were originally part of a private collection of a private museum of primitive art founded by Nelson Rockefeller, who, among many other things, was the governor of New York who championed stop and frisk. Talks about sort of this grouping of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, which is really pre-Columbian Americas, and how it sort of groups them as this interchangeable tribalist other, even though these are huge land masses that are very far apart from each other. The display practices are an issue. The way works are discussed sort of reflects this colonialist history where a lot of the information is forgotten because it wasn't deemed important. And the history of many objects begins when they were transitioned into white hands. Some of also the information that's in here are questions, because I don't have all the answers, and I'm not trying to pretend like I have all the answers. And this is, of course, sort of a simplified presentation of some of this information. But this is the slide that I end on, kind of asking, what is the solution to these colonialist museum frameworks? And the reality is that I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows at this point, because these are really questions and challenges that we as a society, as a culture, as a world, have never really faced and really addressed in their fullest amount. I think there are really beautiful efforts happening to think through these questions, and there are certainly environments that are attempting to address and change these. But I think there are so many sort of responsible parties who need to put this work in, from everything from these institutions themselves to even how we as museum goers understand art from cultures that are unfamiliar to us. This last thing of take everything out of the building and rearrange it all with new categories and priorities, that is, I think, nodding to this notion of flexibility, which Baldwin, in that first quote that I shared, kind of introduces, which is sort of this notion that, like, everything has to change. What we assume to be the standard is just what we're used to, but we really need to be open and flexible to change. And I think what's beautiful about art and art spaces in the art world is that, it really is inherently full of creative people. And so when we make these assumptions that something is incapable of change, then I think we're all selling ourselves short, because then we're no longer bringing our creative talents into these environments. So to go back to Baldwin, another quote again from the same essay, he says, "Society must accept some things as real, but he must always know that visible reality hides a deeper one, and that all our action and achievement rest on things unseen. A society must assume that it is stable, but the artist must know, and he must let us know, that there is nothing stable under heaven. One cannot possibly build a school, teach a child, or drive a car without taking some things for granted. The artist cannot and must not take anything for granted. He must drive to the heart of every answer and expose the question the answer hides." So this, again, from the same essay, The Creative Process, talks about kind of this notion of questions, which I love that Baldwin is sort of asking us as artists and creative people not to seek out the answer, but to expose the question that some kind of a supposed answer hides. And also this notion of visible reality hides a deeper one. I think what's so interesting about art is that it is oftentimes something that we consume and internalize and interpret through the senses. But that often what we feel from it, if we're really sort of exploring something, is beyond that. It's emotional, it's spiritual, and how there are there are avenues within this world that we sort of don't give that same sense of grace and generosity to, including spaces like, kind of museum institutions. Sometimes in more sort of contemporary spaces we do, but oftentimes in an environment like the Met, we're really not investigating why these choices are made the way they are. We're not seeing them as a collection of decisions that some flawed human being made. But I think, what is so exciting about sort of creative work is that, there's this opportunity for creative thinking. And to me, what is the way that I sort of like to think about it is we often talk about sort of finding balance or achieving a sense of balance in how something is done, but it's really about practicing balance, where there's always sort of an effort being made to make adjustments. And instead of focusing on some kind of a final product, we can create processes that allow for change to take place where it is necessary, because change is usually necessary. So this is another quote from a writer, Bell Hooks, and I like to integrate quotes from other people when I give sort of presentations and things, because I know that other people's words are so much better than mine. But Bell Hooks says, "Learning to see and appreciate the presence of beauty is an act of resistance in a culture of domination that recognizes the production of a pervasive feeling of lack, both material and spiritual, as a useful colonizing strategy." So again, I think this notion of beauty is really important when we talk about why art should be valued, because I think it sort of, instead of it being about something that it like a sort of scarce resource or something that is sort of an elite thing, whether it's sort of educational accolades or some sort of an institutional association or a family connection or whatever it is the appreciation of beauty that is an act of resistance. Because in the end, in its essence, I think even art that is not quote unquote pretty is really about the unveiling and the discovery of beauty in some capacity, whether it's beauty of a human experience, the beauty of sort of loss and recovery. But that, in our culture of dominance, whether we're talking about materialism, colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, elitism, classism, whatever it is, that it is sort of this pushing through these forces through an appreciation of beauty and this recognition that everybody has the capacity to create beauty, where those kind of assumptions and structures lose a lot of their power. In the work that I do, also in the beginning, sort of presenting sort of more academic research that I've done. A lot of the work I do also is thinking about what are sort of these spaces of education and access that exist, and that's why I love writing and being a storyteller in various mediums, because I know that my love for art has really come through the stories that I've been able to know, and I recognize absolutely that when I know more about a work, I appreciate it more, and when I understand the stories and the context for works, I have these transformed appreciations for them. And so I want to also share another project that I've done. So this is a work that I made for the Four Freedoms 2020 Awakening. And the Awakening was a project that invited artists from across the country to design billboards that would then be put up. So it's not an ad, it's an artwork. And there was a series of the project that incorporated, asked artists to incorporate questions into their work. So my question is, what do you keep when you go? And the work itself features images overlapping and sort of bleeding together of 7 generations of women of my maternal side. So me, my mom, my mom's mom, my mom's mom's mom, et cetera, for 7 generations. And what I really, I am again, sort of primarily a writer, sometimes an artist. But what I really appreciated about this opportunity was to think about how, a lot of the work that I do is focused on sort of justice and whether it's representational justice or sort of acknowledging histories in order to sort of move forward into a transformed future. But I think it's important also to acknowledge sort of our more individual and personal stories. So creating this work was, I think, as Bell Hooks talks about it, sort of this recognition of beauty as resistance, where, the beauty that we bring, whether it's as artists, as people who are viewing art, as people who are part of this process, whether you're a curator or administrator or a docent or a security guard or whatever sort of your role is within this structure, is that, our personal stories and experiences bring a lot of richness to the work that we do, the work that we might do. I'll also sort of explain the, above and below that sort of middle question. There are two more questions that are asked. My family is from Iran. And so the bottom line is the translation of this question: what do you keep when you go? But the top line is the question written in English, but in Persian script. And the idea is that you can only read it if you approach it from both cultures and languages. And I think that's something that I definitely bring to the kind of work that I do, where, I'm the daughter of immigrants, the daughter of a refugee, the sort of descendant of people who have experienced deep hardships. And for that, I think that gives me sort of a lot of why I appreciate beauty so much, is sort of this insistence on selfhood and decision, sort of making your own decisions. And I think art making is such a reflection of that, because it is this sort of deeply personal and vulnerable process. In addition, and this is, sort of a funny thing that I do too, is I am a host on the Soul Pancake, which is a media company TikTok account. And my role with Soul Pancake is to share information about art. So I'm going to share a couple TikToks with you all, but we'll watch this first one. And they all run around 40 seconds long.
Art is a lot more compelling when you know what you're looking at. Take this sculpture, for example. Looks like a woman, maybe of African descent. She's wearing this blue dress, but it's kind of mismatched. What's going on here? That piece is by South African sculptor Mary Sibande, and that character, whose name is Sophie, appears again and again in her work, wearing a similar style of clothing. Sophie is a reclamation and reimagination of the many women who were forced into domestic labor during apartheid in South Africa, including many in Sibande's own family. This blue dress that she wears is based on the common maid's uniform during apartheid, but enhanced with Victorian-styled ruffles and proportions. Sophie is Sibande's way of taking back the space, nobility, and worth that was stolen from generations of women through apartheid and colonialism. Unbound by servitude, Sophie rewrites an ugly history into a beautiful fantasy.
So that's one example of one of the TikToks I've made. But what I think is so beautiful about this project that I'm doing is that it is really thinking about expanding the bounds of how we see art, who gets to see art, who appreciates art. And what it's taught me is kind of this really beautiful, stunning, undeniable enthusiasm that people have for works. And on these videos, it's pretty remarkable to see. I mean, there have been a few million views across the handful of videos that I've made. And there are so many comments from people remarking how, grateful they are to have this knowledge, but also how it is through these stories that they're really able to appreciate the works. So here is another TikTok.
Christine Sun Kim, or CK, is a deaf artist who makes work about sound, and that's her at the Super Bowl with Demi Lovato. She advocates for the use of sign language, shares her experience as a deaf person, integrates sign language into common phrases, and demonstrates deaf English. Take this work that visualizes the sign for future. Her work is filled with humor while addressing a serious lack of representation and support for deaf people, like teaching her daughter to sign to share gossip, but also so the family can speak together. By visualizing sounds and making bold statements about the importance of accessibility, she makes deaf people impossible to ignore. I know that I've learned a lot from her work, and I'm grateful to artists who invite viewers to learn from them.
so with this, with both of these videos about Christine Sun Kim and Mary Sabande, I think they really sort of demonstrate the same principles that this sort of Instagram graphic post demonstrated, which is this notion of knowledge share, and how when we are willing to offer what we know, and also what we know through this sort of lens of what we love, how powerful it is, and how for a long time, art has been something that is kind of owned by the elite, accessed by the elite. But that doesn't have to be the case. There are certainly pockets where that is changing, and groups that are working in incredible ways to change that. But something even as brief as a 40-second video, can have an impact and introduce somebody to something that they wouldn't have known otherwise. With all the TikToks, also, it's important, I think, for me to demonstrate how the identity of the artist impacts the work that they create, because our lived experiences are all unique, and they impact the way that we see ourselves and the way that we're able to create. So I want to show one last video.
Let's talk about the Silhouette series by artist Ana Mendieta. The series consists of over 200 works created in Iowa and Mexico, depicting an abstract feminine figure with her arms above her head. As a Cuban exile, Mendieta draws on Afro-Cuban Santeria and indigenous Taino spiritual traditions to imprint and represent her body on the earth. In some cases, it's pretty subtle. Other works depict the intense trauma of disconnection and destruction, of violence that links the experience of the earth and women's bodies. The series conveys this feeling of being held in and remembered by the earth, but nothing really lasts. The earthworks are described as sculptures, created both by adding and taking away material. But today they only exist as photographs, memories of what once was. It's maybe ironic that Ana Mendieta's most known work is of a disappeared feminine body. Just a few years after the series was completed, she died after falling 33 stories from a New York City window. Her husband, a famous artist, was the only suspect and was acquitted of the crime.
So that video, this last video, and I did all three women artists in celebration of NAWA and this organization. This last video was part of a collaboration that we've just started with Museum of Contemporary Art in LA. And what's exciting about this series is that we're working with the collection of MoCA to create TikTok videos that bring people, and TikTok users are primarily young people, into sort of this world, and to introduce them to artists and ideas that they maybe haven't been introduced to before. And I think it really, challenges the notion of what is a museum space. Where do the walls of a museum exist? Where, we might see the museum ending kind of where its physical walls end, but can a museum exist beyond that into the ideas that it shares, the way people understand their works, the conversations that people are having about what they've seen at the museum, and be really sort of unbound spaces for cultural exchange, which I think is really where this work comes alive, and where the sort of most special spaces are for appreciating art. I want to end here with yet another quote from James Baldwin, because I really, as such an optimist, I love his writing and his work. So this is one of my favorite quotes of his. He says, "Perhaps the whole root of our trouble, the human trouble, is that we will sacrifice all the beauty of our lives. We'll imprison ourselves in totems, taboos, crosses, blood sacrifices, steeples, mosques, races, armies, flags, nations, in order to deny the fact of death, which is the only fact we have. It seems to me that one should rejoice in the fact of death. One ought to decide, indeed, to earn one's death by confronting with passion the conundrum of life. One is responsible to life. It is that small beacon from that terrifying darkness from whence we came and whence we shall return." And I think in his sort of list in the beginning there, you could add museums and paintings and sculptures and all these sort of materials that we use in art making, because it does definitely seem like we sort of imprison ourselves within the bounds of what already exists in order to deny the reality that nothing is forever. And I think maybe the example of naming this space in the Met the Rockefeller Wing, or sort of the naming practices that we have, is sort of an exercise in denying death, where we try to create a sense of permanence where there really isn't one. But I think you know, what is so exciting about right now is this growing movement to recognize that everything we have is impermanent. Even though we might assume that a physical object is permanent, it is not. Everything will decompose, everything will pass away. Um, but what we do have is how we appreciate beauty and how we understand access to beauty. And even as we are exploring these ideas in our own fleeting lives and practices, this is kind of our responsibility, to increase the amount of beauty in the world, maybe to decrease somehow the amount of suffering in the world, um, and to be part of a process of creative exchange. um, I'm gonna just stop the screen share for a moment while I close out. But you know, when we look at museum spaces, um, they definitely communicate some sort of a sense of aesthetic hierarchy. But it's important to remember that these aesthetic and cultural hierarchies are not fixtures. They're products of how we talk about things, who we give access to, um, the way that narratives are told. And just as things can be, have been constructed, they can also be deconstructed. And as they're deconstructed, they're better understood. And surely to make room for what's new, we have to kind of take apart what is old. Um, I think it in itself is sort of a process of art making, um, and a process of beauty in um, you know kind of engaging in experimentation. But it's also really exciting, and whether we're thinking about how we construct um, a physical museum space, or we're using social media as a tool to bring more people into the conversation, these are really uh, potent opportunities for you know deconstructing and re-understanding the ways that we have seen things in the past moving forward into the future. I want to close out there and thank NAWA so much for inviting me to give this presentation. Thank everybody who is watching, um, and wish you all the best in your efforts to transform the world